Okay, I think we're ready to start. Welcome everyone to our first all-Zoom EGPP research seminar. This is the third seminar in the EGPP Seminar Series. A particularly warm welcome to our speaker today, Hans-Peter Krisi of the European University Institute. His presentation focuses on the political consequences of the Great Recession. He will present key results of the POLCON project. Thank you very much, Hans-Peter, for being with us today. You will speak for about 40 minutes, and this will be followed by Q&A. Participants can use the hand function on Zoom when they wish to ask a question or make a comment. Please remember also to mute your microphone while others are speaking. Thank you very much. Hans-Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, I try to share my screen. Okay, as Daniele said, I'm going to talk about key results of the POLCON project. Now, the POLCON project was a project on the political consequences, that's why POLCON, of the Great Recession. And today, of course, we are in the thrall of yet another big crisis. And in the meantime, since the Great Recession, there has been a refugee crisis, a Brexit crisis, a climate change crisis, and the Great Recession is almost forgotten. But I still think that it is useful to remind ourselves of the political consequences in terms of elections on the one hand, and in terms of protest on the other hand. Here you see some members of the project. It was a big team, and these were the most important people in the team. In the project, we had a lot of publications, but I just want to show you these two books. One is on party politics and the other one is on protest politics. We are in the process of finalizing the manuscript of a third book that will be at the end of this month delivered to Cambridge University Press if everything works out well. So what I'm going to present you today is the conceptual framework in very broad strokes of the project, and then two sets of results: the mobilization of protests in the crisis and its consequences, and the structuration of the party systems in the shadow of the crisis. And finally, I will present a few conclusions. First, the conceptual framework. Now, this is in very broad strokes how we approached the topic. On the left-hand side, you have the long-term structural change. We take a macro historical view, if you want, and focus on the cleavage structures in particular, the set of political conflicts that are rooted in social structure. We also pay attention to political legacies and to the context of the European multi-level polity. These long-term factors are at a given moment in time before the crisis intervenes, resulting in a configuration of party competition on the one hand, in a configuration of mobilization structures on the other hand. And then the crisis, the short-term factors intervene. It's an economic crisis with variable severity depending on the country, with variable timing with regard to the political process ongoing in a given country. And this economic crisis in some countries is the catalyst for a political crisis, depending on, among other things, the incumbency, who is in government, and depending on the party's strategies. The result of the long-term factors in combination with the short-term crisis factors is a transformation, on the one hand, of party competition, and on the other hand, of the mobilization of protest, or the absence of such a transformation. Now, the structuration of party competition, starting from Lipset and Rocken, we can distinguish between these four basic conflicts in Western European societies, which essentially boil down in an economic and a cultural dimension. The economic dimension is giving rise to class conflicts, and the cultural dimension to religious conflicts. There are center-periphery conflicts as well, and there are also rural-urban conflicts, but class and religion have traditionally been the main structuring factors of European party systems. Now, we contended that these classical factors have been transformed, especially on the cultural dimension, by two waves of mobilization that have swept across Western Europe since the 1960s. On the one hand, the wave of the Cultural Revolution, the silent revolution of Ingelhart's that started in the 60s and went on until the 1980s. And then the wave of in the sign of globalization that occurred since the 1990s until the present. The first wave gave rise to the new left and green parties and transformed the Social Democrats from a working class party essentially to a new middle class party. The second wave gave rise to the mobilization by the radical populist right. Now, how, as a result of these factors, has party competition been structured at the eve of the Great Recession? Very importantly, we distinguish between three European regions in our project, between Northwestern Europe, Southern Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe. And first, Northwestern Europe, these two waves of mobilization had the greatest impact in Northwestern Europe. And as a result of these two waves of mobilization, we think that a new cleavage is shaping up. We call it the demarcation integration cleavage. Others have called it different names. For example, Hoche and Marx call it the Gall-Tann cleavage. Zürn and his co-authors from the WZB, they call it the cosmopolitan communitarian cleavage, and so forth. This is a cleavage opposing, on the one hand, the Greens, the New Left, and the left in general, and on the other hand, the radical right, or the conservative, nationalist, traditional right, on the other hand, on the cultural dimension. In Southern Europe, the impact of these two waves of mobilization has been much more limited, and accordingly, the transformation previous to the crisis of the party system has been much more limited. So we have essentially at the outset of the crisis an alignment of the traditional conflicts of class and religion in the absence of strong new conflicts, a bipolar party competition between a secular left and a culturally conservative religious right. In Central and Eastern Europe, the two waves also had a limited impact for different reasons than in Southern Europe. I cannot go into these reasons in detail now, but the result after the transition to democracy in these countries was a weakly institutionalized party system, hardly rooted in the social structure, with the main structuring conflicts referring to the cultural dimension. Now, against this background, you have the crisis experience. And what I shall show you are two indicators characterizing the crisis experience in the three regions: unemployment rates for the economic experience and satisfaction with democracy, an indicator for the political experience. On the left, you have unemployment rates, and you have three lines, one for each region. And you see that previous to the crisis which intervened, that's the dashed vertical line in the fall of 2008, you have a decline in unemployment rates across Europe. And then the unemployment rates go up, but in Northwestern Europe, they only go up to the level of the early 2000s and remains relatively stable. So Northwestern Europe is not touched very much. In the other two regions, unemployment rates go up explosively, but in Central and Eastern Europe, they return to pre-crisis levels after 2012, 2013, whereas it is in Southern Europe that the crisis really hits hard and unemployment rates stay at very high levels. Now turn to the right, to satisfaction with democracy. It is continuously high in Northwestern Europe and continuously low in Central and Eastern Europe. Central and Eastern Europe have a chronic political crisis that is manifested in very high levels of dissatisfaction among the electorate. It is in Southern Europe, again, where the crisis strikes hard. From relatively high levels, satisfaction with democracy drops precipitously to a level as low as in Central and Eastern Europe. So in Southern Europe, the crisis is a double crisis. It's an economic and a political crisis. In Northwestern Europe, it's a very limited crisis. And in Central and Eastern Europe, it's a crisis that is severe in the beginning, but that is overcome relatively rapidly. Now, so far, so much for concepts. Now, the results, some key results with respect to the mobilization of protest in the crisis. We spent a lot of time in this project to collect protest event data in 30 European countries. The 27 EU member states in 2008 at the beginning of the crisis, plus Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland. And we did so for the period from 2000 to 2015. The key indicator I will show you is the number of protest events and the number of participants per month, both numbers per month. And the key result you will see is the double economic and political crisis in the south drives a protest wave, whereas in the other two parts of Europe, we don't see a protest wave. Now, here you have the graph in question. You have Northwestern Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, the number of protests in blue, the number of participants in gray. And you can see that in Northwestern Europe, at the first vertical dashed line, that's the start of the financial crisis. The second dashed line is the start of the Eurozone crisis. At the start of the financial crisis, protest reaches a peak, but from then on, it almost continuously declines to very low levels, lower levels than pre-crisis. And the same more or less happens in Eastern Europe. You have a peak of protest at the beginning of the crisis, but then a less continuous fall, but a fall to very low levels at the end of the crisis in 2015. On the other hand, in Southern Europe, you have a wave of protest that picks up in the financial crisis, but really explodes in the Eurozone crisis, reaches peaks in 2012 and 2013, and then declines also, I would stress this, also to levels which are below the levels of pre-crisis situations. If we look at the content of these waves, we can see that the wave in Southern Europe is essentially a public economic protest wave. That is, it is a wave against the austerity policies of the governments. You see there is also a bit of a political issue wave, but this wave is much smaller, and it is essentially an economic protest against government policies. In the other two regions, political and public economic protests are more or less flat across the entire period. Now, what are the consequences of these protest phenomena. We argue that the most important consequence of protest during the Great Recession is the spillover effect of protest. Protest serves as a signal that amplifies the electoral punishment of incumbents in particular and of mainstream parties in general. In other words, protest conditioned the impact of the economic grievances on elections. The punishment of mainstream parties occurs only if economic grievances are politicized by the mobilization of public economic protest previous to the elections, between two elections. And you can see that here. The dependent variable in this graph is the effect of economic grievances on the punishment or the support of parties. And you have the gray line, which is the line for mainstream parties. And you see that as protest increases, the punishment effect of economic grievances increases. Whereas for non-mainstream parties, they actually benefit from protest, not to the extent that the mainstream parties are punished, but they benefit from protest. I insisted on the large-scale demobilization in the protest arena at the end of the crisis. And interestingly, this demobilization is accompanied by the accentuated rise of new challenger parties in the electoral arena. New challengers from the left in Southern Europe and new challengers from the right in Northwestern Europe. So there is a shift of the mobilization of protest from the protest arena to the electoral arena. What is generally called the rise of populism in the literature, I would suggest, is linked to this shift of the mobilization of protest from the streets to the voting booth. The electoral arena, my suggestion, becomes an alternative to protest politics in the streets, especially in Southern Europe. Now, this brings me to the second part of the results in terms of the restructuration of the party systems. And the data here are electoral results, vote shares and volatility, as well as electoral campaigns. And the working horse for our project were actually electoral campaign data. We studied the politicization of issues by parties. And when we say politicization of issues by parties, we look at the salience of certain issues for parties and the positioning of the parties on these issues. And politicization would be the combination, the product of salience times position, which means that in order for an issue to be politicized, it has to be both salient and in terms of positions, it has to be polarized. Now, we studied the election campaigns based on a content analysis of quality newspapers in 15 countries, 7 Northwestern European countries, 6 we had already studied in the past, Austria, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and UK. But we added Ireland because Ireland was one of the very hard-hit countries by the crisis. And then we had the 4 Southern European countries and 4 Eastern European countries in our sample of countries. And for each country, we studied at least 2 elections preceding the crisis and all elections since the crisis up to 2015. Now, I show you just one result in terms of votes and volatility. It's the changes in the mainstream party vote shares and the changes in volatility on average in the 3 regions. As you see, the black columns are the changes in mainstream party vote. In all three regions, mainstream parties have lost vote shares during the crisis, and they have done so most pronouncedly in Southern Europe. At the same time, volatility has increased most in Southern Europe. So the Southern European party systems have undergone most of the change compared to party systems in other regions. Actually, in Central and Eastern Europe, volatility has to some extent decreased during the crisis, albeit on a very high level of volatility. These were non-institutionalized, non-consolidated party systems. But if anything, during the crisis, they more or less consolidated and did not fragment like the party systems in the other two regions. Now, from now on, I will just show you results from the election campaign data, and I will do so by region. I start with Northwestern Europe. In Northwestern Europe, there are two scenarios, a scenario of continuity and a scenario of catching up. These party systems have been restructured or being restructured by the radical right. And the scenario of continuity applies to the countries where the radical right had already been established before the crisis. Our examples are Austria, Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. In the two countries where the radical right had not been established before, the crisis served as a catalyst for the emergence of the radical right. These are Germany and the UK. Now, Ireland is the odd country out because we had expected that in Ireland, as a result of the very important crisis, new parties, new challengers would arise. But actually in Ireland, the incumbents were punished very heavily, but the parties that benefited were mainstream parties, and new parties only belatedly, I put it here, Sinn Féin in the elections this year became the largest party in Ireland, but we would have expected that this would happen earlier. Moreover, note that Sinn Féin is not a radical right party, it's a radical left party. So Sinn Féin actually resembles what I will describe for Southern Europe. And accordingly, the Irish party system develops rather more similarly to Southern European party systems. So the radical right drives the change by mobilizing above all on the twin new cultural issues, immigration and European integration, and it reinforces this integration demarcation divide. You see it here. On the left, you see the vote shares of the radical right and the Greens, the two opposites on the transformed cultural system, cultural dimension. And you see that both types of parties since the 1970s have been continuously on the increase, and also throughout the crisis. You see on the right-hand side the salience of the two issues of the radical right, the European issue and the immigration issue. And you see that until the mid-90s, these issues became ever more salient. Then the salience flattened, the increase of salience flattened out. But since the crisis, the Great Recession, again, in Northwestern Europe, immigration and European integration have become more salient to reach peak salience in 2015. On the other hand, cultural liberalism and environmentalism have diminished in importance for party competition in Northwestern Europe during the crisis. Now, I will show you for specific countries how the party system has been restructured during the crisis. And I will show you based on the party's positions on issues weighted by salience. And I will show you based on the results of multidimensional scaling. Now, this sounds fancy, but it is simply a method for representing in a condensed way all possible party issue pairs. And the statistical procedure tries to do so in as low a dimensional space as possible. So if the party system space would be one-dimensional, we would see just a left-right opposition. If it's two-dimensional, we would see, as I will show you, an economic dimension and a cultural dimension. If we had three-dimensional solutions, we would see more than two dimensions, but luckily for us, the optimal solutions are always two-dimensional. The horizontal axis in the graphs I will show you is the economic axis. The vertical axis is the cultural axis. And as you will see, the axes are in many countries are correlated. So the left is more culturally liberal and at the same time economically more statist than the right. And that leads to the fact that the two dimensions are correlated, although one dimension is not sufficient to describe the space. And what I will show you is the graphs on the one hand for the pre-crisis situation, and on the other hand for the crisis or the post-crisis situation. And I will start with Northwestern Europe, with France. Now, France is an example for the continuity. And you see the two graphs on the left in the 2000s and in 2017 look pretty similar. You have the horizontal dimension going from welfare, pro-welfare, to pro-economic liberalism on the right. And you have the vertical dimension going from cultural liberalism to opposition to immigration. And in the space, you have a triangle, a great triangle, which connects the three major parties. The Parti Socialiste, the UMP and Front National in the 2000s, and the Parti Socialiste, République en Marche and Front National in 2017. And you have a dashed line which also connects to show you where the radical left is situated. Now, what you see is that, first of all, a convergence on the economic dimension of all major contestants. And you also see that the polarization or the structuration in the party system is mainly based on the cultural dimension, where it increases during the crisis. So the crisis contributes to an increase of the structuration effect of the cultural dimension. The next case I will show you is Germany. The very similar situation in the 2000s, except there is no radical right. So you have the two dimensions similarly situated with the SPD, the Free Democrats, and the CDU, CSU very close in the same space. Now let's see what happens in 2017 with the rise of the AfD. You suddenly see that SPD, FDP, and the Union have been competing in a very limited space. And the introduction of the AfD introduces an expansion of the space, especially on the cultural dimension. So in Germany too, the cultural dimension becomes more structuring than it has been before the crisis. Now let's turn to Central and Eastern Europe. This is a scenario not of continuity, but of consolidation of still fairly volatile party systems. In Central and Eastern Europe, you had a chronic political crisis preceding the economic crisis, but you had a consolidation which already started in Poland in the years 2000. In the middle of the 2000, when PO won the elections in 2007, I think, the consolidation of the party system started. In the other three countries, which we studied, the economic crisis actually served as a catalyst for the consolidation of the party system. Now, economic issues are very salient in Eastern Europe, but they don't contribute to the structuration of party competition because they are not polarizing. The major parties converge in a politics of outbidding on the economic dimension. And political corruption is also a highly salient issue, but also this issue is not very much structuring the party system because all the parties claim that they are opposed to corruption. Now, the really structuring element in Central and Eastern European party systems are cultural issues which are politicized by the right and which are politicizing and polarizing in terms of what we call defensive nationalism, defensive against internal and external forces. And here you have the example of Hungary, which is a relatively consolidated party system, just as Poland in Central and Eastern Europe. You have the situation in 2006 and the situation in 2014. You have the same two dimensions as in Northwestern Europe. But as you see, the parties are mainly competing, polarizing on the cultural dimension, with Fidesz being in the nationalist corner and the former communists, the Social Democrats, MSZP, in the culturally liberal, democratically reformist corner. And not much changes with the crisis. The structure is the same, just the vote shares have, of course, changed enormously. There is also now a third competitor, Jobbik, which is closely situated in the nationalist corner, together with Fidesz. And Poland tells a very similar story. In 2007, you have PO and PiS and SLD in a handkerchief. They are very close together in a, let's say, economically relatively social democratic corner, far from economic liberalism and cultural liberalism. By 2015, the structure has moved into the direction of the Hungarian structure, with on the one hand PiS in the nationalist corner and PO, Novosena, ZLEW in the culturally liberal, pro-European, democratically renewal corner. So you have a very similar development as in Hungary. Now, finally, Southern Europe. In Southern Europe, the scenario is one of transformation, driven by the protest waves. The scenario is transformation except for Portugal. So here, Portugal is the odd man out. In the other three countries, Podemos, Syriza, and Cinque Stelle, the radical left are driving the transformation. I put Cinque Stelle between brackets. Many would not agree that it is radical left, but from our point of view, it is the functional equivalent of Syriza and Podemos in the other two countries. These parties mobilize against austerity and for democratic renewal. So they mobilize for new politics against old politics. And we have an alignment of economic and political issues in the mobilization of the new parties. They crowd out cultural issues. But in some countries, we have to take into account specific secondary issues. And I will show you this for Spain and Greece. This is the situation in Spain before the crisis. It's pretty much a bipolar situation, as I said in the beginning, for this region. There is a second dimension which has to do with regionalism. So Spain already in 2004 had some secondary element, but basically it's PSOE against PP. Now see what happens as a result of the crisis. You still have the regional dimension, but you now have no longer just two, you have four contenders. And you have an alignment of democratic renewal and rather more left-wing positions versus the old conservative, economically liberal party, PP. So you have a much more complex, much more fragmented party system. And the driver of transformation in this particular case was the radical left plus a second party, Ciudadanos. Now, finally, Greece, my last example. In Greece, you have on the left the situation in 2007, on the right, the situation in the first elections in 2015. On the left, you see also a bipolar party system to begin with. You have PASOK against ND, Neo-Democracia, PASOK on the more culturally liberal welfare state side, and Neo-Democracia on the more culturally conservative, not very economically liberal side. But you have some minor left-wing parties, KQA, the communists, and Syriza, a new left party. Now see what happens in 2015. PASOK moves together with Neo-Democracia in the memorandum position. These are the parties that are pro-bailout, and they are opposed by the radical left, Syriza and KQA, who are anti-bailout and anti-memorandum. And this is the structuring dimension. Those who are pro-bailout and those who are anti-bailout. And what happens is PASOK is losing vote shares and is replaced essentially by Syriza as the new pole on the left, defending traditional left-wing positions. Let me conclude. The structure of national politics is driven by a combination of long-term factors. We stress the cleavage structure, but there is also regime legacies, and there are EU institutional conditions. A combination between these long-term factors and short-term conjunctures, that is economic and political crises, which mobilize protest that shapes party politics. The question is whether the Great Recession was a critical juncture in European party politics. And the answer to the question is that it had a rather modest impact in Northwestern Europe, where we have a scenario of continuity. And it also had a rather modest impact in Central and Eastern Europe, where we have a scenario of consolidation. It had a profound impact in Southern Europe, which where it gave rise to a transformation of party systems, except in Portugal. But let's take the Greek example. You could argue that there is a profound change. There's a new challenger which has come in and which has restructured the party system. The old center-left party has virtually disappeared. But you could also argue that what has happened is nothing more than the reproduction of the old equilibrium, bipolar equilibrium, in a new guise. You have Syriza, which replaces PASOK, and you have the same dynamics in the party system as you had before. I have not said very much about the contingent nature of what I have described in this presentation, but the restructuration, of course, depends on many factors. First of all, on the depth of the crisis. Northwest and Eastern Europe versus Southern Europe. I've talked about this. It depends on the depth and the nature of the political crisis. Northwestern Europe has a gradual buildup of a crisis of representation, which is articulated by the radical right. Eastern Europe has a chronic performance crisis, and Southern Europe had a sudden performance crisis, which led to very different dynamics. But there are other contingent elements. The mobilization of protest I talked about, but for example, the incumbency at the critical moment is very important. It is very important that in Southern Europe, it was essentially left-wing governments that were in power when the crisis hit and that had to do austerity policies. So you get, because of the contingent factors, you get unpredictable dynamics in the critical moment. The more important long-term effects are two, I think. The one is the institutionalization of protest. I really think that what has been going on in the aftermath of this crisis is the rise of challenger parties and the shift of protest from the protest to the electoral arena. And the second long-term effect is mainly a long-term effect in Northwestern Europe. The crisis has accentuated in Northwestern Europe long-term trends that preceded the Great Recession. It has led to a deepening of the integration, demarcation, cleavage. It has not, this crisis has not had anything to do with the integration, demarcation, cleavage in the other two regions. But this is an afterthought, maybe for discussion. The crises that have emerged in the meantime, since 2015, the refugee crisis, the Brexit crisis, and the climate change crisis may have more to do and may have been more recent catalysts for the institutionalization of the new integration, demarcation, cleavage, even outside of Northwestern Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter, for a very, very rich talk. I'm sure there are many questions. The floor is now open for questions and comments. I am trying to see what's the best way to do this. I saw some hands, but I don't see them now. So, yes. Philip, please.
Thank you, Hans-Peter, for a very interesting talk. I was especially interested by your graphs on the restructuring of the party systems. And you said the two dimensions, the cultural dimension and the economic dimension, they are correlated. And that's quite obvious from your graphs. But what's interesting is that the direction of the correlation varies across countries and varies across time. So in France, for instance, anti-immigration parties tend to be economically liberal. In Hungary, anti-immigration parties tend to be economically welfarist. And in Greece, PASOK tended to be economically welfarist in the early 2000s and is now the most economically liberal party in Greece. So what determines the direction of the correlation of these two dimensions?
It's a very good question, but I mean, there are party strategies. But before I go into details, I would say that in general, the correlations are similar in the countries. I mean, Greece is the obvious blatant exception. In Greece 2015, the direction changes radically. And the direction also changes a little bit in Eastern Europe. But in generally, I would say it's either perpendicular or it's shifted to the left. the correlation is more on the left-hand side, which means, as you said in the beginning, that the left is more culturally liberal and the anti-immigration parties are more economically liberal. Now, this has something to do with the party strategies, I think, on the radical right side. Kitchell has argued that the radical right has a magic formula. So the magic formula of the radical right is a combination of culturally being opposed to immigration and economically to be liberal. And why has he said it's a magical formula? Because the coalition of the radical right is a coalition of the working class, which you get by appealing to opposition to immigration, and the old middle class, which you get by being economically liberal. Now, this combination has originally been indeed the positioning of the radical right, and it is still the positioning of the radical right in a country like Switzerland. But in other countries, because the working class component became ever more important in their constituency, the parties have moved more away from economic liberalism. For example, in France, this party is no longer economically liberal, and in other countries as well. So depending on the party strategies, I would say the correlation is more, or the vertical line is more or less skewed. But let me say one more, let me draw your attention to the fact that these lines are in the eyes of the beholder. So the contrary to factor analysis, this multidimensional scaling does not create the dimensions. It just creates points in the space. And in order to interpret the points in the space, the analyst can draw lines. So we have drawn the lines ourselves by connecting always the same kind of issues. We connect cultural liberalism to opposition to immigration, and we connect always welfare state to economic liberalism. But sometimes we had to connect cultural liberalism to defense because there was no opposition to immigration, like in the case of the Spanish elections in, I think, 2005. So there is a lot of interpretation already included in the pictures I showed you, but I would say it's not an arbitrary interpretation, it's theory guided. It's driven by our expectation that there would be these cultural and economic dimensions.
Okay, thank you. I don't see hands in the list of participants. Yes, now Stephen and then Odysseus. Stephen, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. It's super interesting. I have 2 points I'd like to make. So the first one would be your thoughts on, as another consequence of the Great Recession, the rise in support for independence in Scotland and in Catalonia, and whether you see this as it's framed more and more along the lines of social justice and economic redistribution, whether this is some sort of equivalent of the rise in support for challenger parties. And my second point is on the cases of Ireland and Portugal, where although we do not see any new challenger parties, do you think that existing parties are playing the role of challengers? So in Portugal, we have Bloc Esquerda and the Communist Party. And then in the Irish case, we have the rise in support for Sinn Féin. So although there are not new parties, there are still the same voting patterns for more radical options but it's just a different realization of more or less the same phenomenon, which we have seen in Greece and in Spain.
Yes. I'm glad for both questions. The first question about the rise and support of independence in Scotland and Catalonia, let me answer it based on Catalonia. Because one member of our POLCON team wrote a thesis where he tried to explain, using our concepts, the case of Catalonia. And indeed, I mean, you see that the second dimension in the Spanish case is the regional dimension. And the argument of my doctoral student was that actually the CEU, the Convergencia y Unión, the big Catalan regionalist party, used regionalism and separatism in particular in order to avoid punishment. It was the incumbent party, punishment as a result of economic grievances. So here you have an example of party strategy. The party strategically opted for the regionalist card in order to avoid being punished for the economic fallout of the crisis. I mean, to prove something like this is pretty difficult, but he concluded it from the sequence of events which made it rather plausible. Also the sequence of support for separatism in the Catalan population. Both are closely linked to the shift of the party strategy in the direction of separatism. And the party made this shift just before regional elections. So I think your first hunch is entirely correct. The second one about Ireland and Portugal, again, I think you're right. Let's take the case of Portugal. You had a Communist Party and you had Bloco Esquerda. So you had already two radical left-wing parties. You also had timing issues. I mean, the Social Democrats in Portugal were in power when the crisis struck. And you would have expected them to be punished, and they were punished. But luckily for them, they were punished before the great austerity programs really kicked in. So it was the mainstream right, which eventually did the ultimate, I mean, the socialists also had to do austerity, but at the right moment they lost power, and the center-right parties did austerity, so the socialists could return to their old position of being against austerity. So actually their electoral defeat in the long run, I would say, saved them and allowed them to recuperate their forces. And the fact that these radical left-wing parties had already been established explains indeed why there was no newcomer. You might have expected that they would win more. The Bloco Esquerda might have taken the road of Syriza, but my argument would be that it did not benefit as much as Syriza from the crisis. First of all, because protest was much more limited. I mean, there was Geração, Arrasca in Portugal. They mobilized even before mobilization in Spain in spring 2011, but it was a relatively polite and short-term protest. So protest disappeared relatively quickly in Portugal. And I think the Bloco Esquerda did not benefit as much from protest as Syriza could benefit from protest, because it was more limited.
I have now a list of 4, Odysseas, Giuseppe, Adrienne, and Claudiana. So Odysseas, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I would like to ask two questions. The first is regarding the distinction you make on mobilizations between mobilizations that address economic issues and political issues. And I would like to ask if you could elaborate a bit more on this distinction. On what grounds you categorize mobilization as purely economic or rather political? The second question has to do about politicization. And I'm wondering whether you perceive politicization as an effect, a consequence of mobilizations. Therefore, parties respond to mobilization by increasing the politicization of a given policy topic, or politicization is a strategy of parties, of contenders, in order to polarize the debate and gain votes. Thank you.
Okay, the first thing, how do I distinguish economic from political issues? I mean, parties talk about different things. And if you talk about corruption or let's say political reform, democratic renewal, if you like Cinque Stelle, for example, say throw the rascals out, tutti a casa, that's a political issue. If you attack directly a political adversary because you think he's corrupt or he's out of date or he does no longer represent anybody, that's political. If you attack your opponent because you think his austerity policy is devastating for the economy, or because you think taxes should be lower, or because you think there should be a stimulus program, then it's an economic issue. So we code issues based on substantive content. The question about politicization, I mean, which issue is politicized by which party is, of course, the result of politically strategic decisions. As I just illustrated with the case of Convergencia y Unión in Barcelona. Also, you have to take into consideration that there is something called issue ownership. Some parties have the reputation to be competent on certain issues. So the radical right, for example, has issue ownership of immigration, and other parties have issue ownership of the economy, of management of the economy, of social justice. The Social Democrats for a long time had issue ownership of welfare state issues. So depending on whether you have issue ownership or not, you will choose to mobilize more on one issue or the other. But if your competitors choose to mobilize on immigration, maybe you cannot avoid the issue. You have, even if you don't have ownership, you have to say something about immigration too. And for example, in Greece, when it is all about bailout, you cannot avoid, even if you know that you are going to lose, if you defend the bailout, you have to take position. So in the nitty-gritty analysis of specific election campaigns, it is, of course, very important which party adopts which kind of strategy. But in the bird's eye view, which I presented you here to see, to show you the grand picture, which I thought was important from a long-term point of view, these party strategies in the final analysis should not be the most important factors in driving party competition.
Giuseppe?
Yes, yes, Peter, thank you very much for this interesting lecture. I was wondering what do you think about the fact of presenting the crisis as a as a single block, let's say. So you give us this comparison pre-crisis and 2015, and perhaps would it be more beneficial for us to look at different stages, or divided in at least two periods, one just in the aftermath, and the other one that is affected both by the economic crisis, but also the political outcome in the first period. Of course, our job is to simplify reality, but my feeling is that there are kind of two, at least two periods. One where parties react to the economic crisis per se, and a second one where there is also a kind of a backlash and a resurgence of right-wing parties in some countries that had disappeared and so on. Thanks.
The idea that there are different periods or different episodes in the crisis is actually a very good one. And in this third book, which I have mentioned, we have decided to study episodes of crisis. So we study specific policy episodes, and for these policy episodes, which are defined by the contest about specific policies, we studied interaction between the challengers and the governments. But I can give you another example where we distinguish stages, and that is with the rise of the new parties. With respect to the rise of the new parties, we have, together with Enrique Hernandez Perez, I have written a paper where we show that there is a typical sequence of punishment of mainstream parties. In the first phase, the incumbent is punished and the mainstream competitor is gaining votes. So the incumbent is replaced by the mainstream competitor. It is in the second phase only when people realize that whether you have center left or center right, it's the same policy, then they will resort to voting for a challenger. And it is only in Greece is the typical example. You have first PASOK, then in the 2012 elections, PASOK is replaced by Nea Demokratia, and then in 2015, Syriza is coming to power. So you have this two-step kind of development of party systems. And you see that also, for example, in Spain. Zapatero loses, PP comes to power, and then after PP has been in power, Podemos and Ciudadanos rise as new challengers against both mainstream parties. So I think that the idea of stages makes a lot of sense.
Thanks for the spoiler about the next book.
I have now on the list Adrienne.
Thanks very much, Hans-Peter, for these fascinating results you were presenting for, as you said, a bird's view. And while listening to you and these very interesting macro results, I was thinking of where is the space here for concrete policy making, right? At the national levels, in the different states. And in a way, my answer to that when I listened to you, it was are you an incumbent in government or not, right? It's in the protest as a reaction to the policies which are adopted by the respective governments. And then you did mention, however, in the case of Greece, that there was within the dynamics of national policy making a reaction to whether the bail-in politics or bail-out politics, bail-in politics, which it was. So my question is, where in your entire conceptual framework do you allow for insights of the political dynamics of policymaking in these states? You did mention also individual pieces, you know, of collaborators on Portugal, for instance, and I'm sure there are many others. Is that where you're analyzing also these concrete policy making, shaping political dynamics?
I mean, you are absolutely right. There is the black box of policy making, which is not approached in, let's say, in the analysis of elections. You analyze the reaction of the citizens to the policy making in elections, or you analyze the reaction in terms of protest. The black box of policy making remains closed. But I have to refer to our third volume, which is indeed trying to opening the black box. So in our third approach to the study of the Great Recession, we study episodes of policy making. So we start with the proposal of the government, with the austerity proposal X of the government, and then we study what happens until this proposal is adopted or shelved. And we study the interaction. We have a relatively simple scheme, and people will say our ontology is too simple, but otherwise we wanted to be parsimonious and avoid to get too complicated. We have the government, we have challengers, and we have third parties. Third parties which can either support the government or the challengers, or they can mediate between the two. And the government can do three things. The government can stick to its proposal, it can make concessions to the challengers, or it can repress the challengers. And the challengers can also do three things. They can mobilize in relatively violent or relatively radical forms. They can mobilize in relatively moderate forms, or they can cooperate with the government. And with this scheme, we try to explain why policies have been adopted in the end or not adopted in the end. And but actually, the scheme is not extremely well suited for these austerity episodes because the maneuvering space of the governments was relatively limited. And the governments in general stuck to their proposed policies, and the challengers could do whatever they wanted to do. Nothing happened. And by the way, I mean, the Greek case is the most blatant case. You have, in the Greek case, you even have the government who tells the people, vote in the referendum against the memorandum, against the bailout. And then a week later or 10 days later, the government adopts the bailout proposal and signs the memorandum. Now, after something like this, what is the public going to do? Surprisingly, the Greek public re-voted in September for Syriza. You might not have expected this, but it was a sort of resignation reaction. The public saw that even Syriza could not get more from the Troika and from the European authorities than what was proposed. So they demobilized and became resigned supporters of the solution proposed by Syriza. And I think this is, in the final analysis, this is what explains the shift from the protest arena to the electoral arena. People, at least in Southern Europe, I would claim, have realized that protest is not very effective. You cannot get very much done by protesting in the street. You can maybe get more done if you support a challenger party. Even that is dubious, as the Greek case shows, but at least you have your people on your side in government, and they try to, you can trust them that they try to do the best they can.
We have Claudiana now.
Yes, hello. I am Claudiana Beshko, a Jean Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. Thank you, Professor Karamani, for sharing this very interesting study with us, and thanks to Professor Priesi for all his thoughts. I'm looking forward to the publishing of this study and to see this idea of the Great Recession as a new cleavage be established in the academic field of political sciences. Although I would say a second Great Recession or a third Great Recession, depending on what will the starting point will be. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the mainstream parties. Although you answered a lot of these questions during the previous answers, I'm interested in the future of the left parties, left traditional parties. As you said, there are protests which are going in the electoral arena, and partly it is explained that people are not identifying themselves anymore with the mainstream parties, especially with the left. What can left traditional parties do in this direction? Thank you.
Yeah, what can they do? Of course, who am I to tell the Social Democrats what they can do? I imagine that your question refers to the Social Democrats, right? They have, first of all, they have the problem that the radical right is very strongly appealing to their traditional constituency, the working class. So the working class in Northwestern Europe has gone over to the radical right. And the Social Democrats have increasingly become new middle class parties. The left has always been internationalist. The left has always been multiculturalist. And this is exactly what bothers the working class. The working class is not internationalist and it's not multiculturalist. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem of the Social Democrats are the Greens, because the Greens directly compete with them for another part of their constituency, namely the new middle class. And with the rise of the issue of climate change, the Greens risk to take away from the Social Democrats what they have retained in the new middle class, which will go over to the perceived environmentally more friendly party of the Greens. Now, I give you one example where these two parties have actually taken over from the mainstream parties. It's the Austrian presidential elections in 2016. At the height of the refugee crisis, the Social Democrats were in government. Werner Faymann was the chancellor together with ÖVP. And there were presidential elections in April 2016. And what happens? In the first round, both mainstream parties candidates lose out against the Green candidate on the one hand and the radical right candidate on the other hand. Now, this is precisely illustrating the problem of the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats in Austria have not disappeared after that event, but this particular event illustrates what is in the cards for the Social Democrats. They might be outcompeted by the Greens on the one hand and the radical right on the other hand, which are the protagonists, if we are right, on this new cleavage of integration demarcation. the Social Democrats, I think, cannot gain back their working class constituency. And it's also a declining constituency. So what they have to do, in my view, is to stick to their multiculturalist, internationalist, cosmopolitan kind of position, combining it with their traditional social justice position. So if they succeed in showing their traditional clients that they are actually the most reliable social justice defenders, they might retain whatever they have in terms of their traditional clients.
Angelos.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Crisi. This has been a great presentation. I'm not an expert on party politics, so excuse me if my question sounds a bit silly, but I really wonder whether, so what I'm hearing is obviously a story of profound change, but in some ways it's also a story of some structural continuity, right? I mean, I come from Greece, and as you know, I can assure you there's no other country where the impression of profound change and the reality of frustrating continuity, is more evident than Greece, right? So, okay, we have a new challenger party that eventually has now become the structurally center-left party of Greece. So, it bears asking, in what ways is the Greek party system really different today than what it was 10 years ago, apart from perhaps a different label of what is the opposite party to New Democracy. So that's actually, so I personally struggle to understand. So of course, from an analytical perspective, it is quite important if you have a two-party system that is loaded by new questions versus older questions as it happened a decade ago or 20 years ago. And I understand that. So my question is it really the main fault line in terms of change and protest in your story, really the transition from protest on the street to moving into the party system? What I see is really actually the amazing ability of party systems to absorb protest in a way, right? If anything, to even manipulate protest, to dilute protest. In a way, Syriza, for example, has been the best thing that could ever happen to the Eurozone crisis because it resolved it. So I wonder whether, thinking about also the Gilets jaunes in France, really the big divide here is whether you have an actual protest, right, like a Laclawian kind of populist rupture on the street, and everything that once something enters into the party system, to party politics, it is really politics as usual, which of course is great to analyze the different questions, etc. But it really, fundamentally, it is really about life going on pretty much as normal or within specific channels as existed before. Thank you.
I think what you said is very interesting. What you said first about Greece is actually what I suspected, that everything has to change so that everything remains the same. Just change labels. Syriza, exchange Syriza for PASOK, but otherwise not much changes. But that is Southern Europe. And in Northwestern Europe, I claimed that there was real change in the sense that you get the politicization of different issues by different actors. And that changes representation in the party systems to a pretty important extent. Now, I mean, the Greek case is also interesting for me because we are studying now the refugee crisis. And as everybody knows, Greece was overwhelmed by a flood of arrivals from Turkey, Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, who then just continued their travels to the northwest of Europe, where they had a tremendous political impact in terms of the cleavage I'm talking about. In Greece, although there was 1 million people coming in and flowing through, the impact was very, very limited. So you don't have in Greece an anti-immigration party that makes 30% like it made in Austria at the time. So it is really not in Southern Europe so far that, or let's say in Greece so far, that this restructuring is happening. You could see it in Italy. I mean, the Lega has become an anti-immigration party, a new radical right party, like the ones we see in Northwestern Europe. And it has done so mainly in relation to the refugee crisis. You see it in Spain happening. You have Vox, a party which is an anti-separatist party, but which is also similar to what we would call radical populist right in Northwestern Europe. So you could argue, and you see similar effects in Eastern Europe. Fidesz is becoming a very difficult member for the EPP in Europe. It is no longer a center-right party. It is moving into the radical populist right corner, and so is PiS. So you have, and these party systems, as you saw, are already structured on the vertical cultural dimension. So there are signs that what we saw in Northwestern Europe is prefiguring what is going to happen in the other parts of Europe. It just did not happen so much during the Great Recession. I would maintain it is happening as a result of the successor crisis. So the refugee crisis has been much more instrumental in terms of the restructuring according to predicted lines by our approach than the Great Recession. And I would argue that the climate crisis is on the other side of the spectrum, doing more or less the same work. Now, the big question is, of course, how about the COVID crisis? And I'm at a loss so far to discuss the implications of the COVID crisis in terms of, in similar terms as we discussed the Great Recession. And I have the hunch that this has something to do with the fact that public health is a balance issue and raises especially competence questions and not political position questions. And similarly, with the saving of the economy. I mean, everybody agrees that we have to take rather radical measures to save the economy. And in most countries, even right-wing government apply stimulus packages of amazing proportions. So it's also a balance issue. It's a question of competence, which does not structure party systems, at least so far. I mean, as the crisis goes on, we might see different phenomena, but I think that the refugee crisis and the climate crisis and Brexit for Britain, of course, the special British case, have been much more structuring in terms of this demarcation, integration conflict, which we put at the center of the interpretation of what has been going on in European party systems.
Very well, Hans-Peter, you're pointing already to future research avenues to which we all look forward very much. Thank you very, very much for your talk and for answering all the questions. We reach now the end of today's session. The next session will take place on December 2, and we will have a book presentation. As you know, the EGPP Seminar Series combines different types of seminars, research seminars, like we had today, but also book presentations, seminars of the EU Studies Working Group, and conversations for the future of Europe. So next week, in 2 weeks' time, for the next session, we will have a book presentation by Catherine De Vries and Sarah Hobolt, and I hope we will have, again, many participants like today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you very much for having been willing to listen to me for so long. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Thank you, everyone.